All right, friends, so let's go ahead and continue our learning about identifying the issues that were sources of conflict leading up to the American Revolutionary War. We're going to continue taking notes, so please remember to pause and rewind as needed so you can have appropriate understanding. And of course, make sure that you have something to write on and something to write with. All right, so we're going to be focusing on the causes of the American Revolution during this learning cycle. So go ahead and pause and make sure that you have this guided notes graphic organizer in your notes. And then once you have this copy down, go ahead and come on back and we will talk about all of this. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the French and Indian War. So we've been learning about the French and Indian War in our social studies unit, and we know that England won the war, but it was super expensive because not only is war expensive because you need all the supplies, but also to fight this war, they had to get the British soldiers from Britain all the way across the Atlantic, and so that was a bunch of money as well. So King George III, that was king of the time in England, decided to tax the colonies to pay off the debt. So remember, we have taxes now, right? Taxes are a fee that we pay to the government in order to have stuff like schools, roads, services. That's what we do now, right? And so this was the same sort of ideal, but these taxes were specifically imposed to pay off the debt from the war. So go ahead and pause and make sure that we have these notes down. That war was super expensive, and so England decided to tax the colonies. Once you have those notes down, let's talk about a couple different acts. So the first one was the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a tax that mandated a special stamp be on all the printed materials. You can see the stamps right here. What was important about this is you had to pay for the stamp. So it wasn't just that you had to have the stamp on, but you had to pay for it, which was that tax that would go towards paying off that debt. So that was the Stamp Act of 1785, and people started 1765, excuse me, that should be a 6. And people started getting upset because they felt like they weren't really being asked, it wasn't fair, and even though the King of England was like, hey, we fought this war so that way you guys could have extra land and that you guys could be protected, the colonists were not for all of these extra taxes. So then we have the Quartering Act of 1765, which said that the British soldiers that were still in the colonies had to live in barracks or housing provided by the colonial government. So they had to provide shelter and food. This made people upset because colonists, one, did not like the idea of the British soldiers always being there, and two, the colonists did not want to pay for all of this for the British soldiers. So again, making sure that we pause and get down these notes. So then that brings us to the Townshend Acts of 1767. So these taxed goods that were imported to the colonies. So things that came into the colonies for people to buy. So these were goods such as tea, sugar, glass, and paint. And so these were stuff that people had to use every day, especially that tea and sugar. And so there was an extra tax put on them that made it more expensive. This led to that saying of taxation without representation. So the colonists were saying like, hey, we never got to vote on any of this. We were never represented in our ideas. You're taxing us without representation. So again, you can see we're building up towards that overall 1776 start date in which we're really starting to see how the colonists are upset with Britain, and they're starting to build up that anger. So then we have the Tea Tax of 1773. So this Tea Act did not actually give another tax, but it allowed the East India Trading Company to sell tea directly to the colonies. It actually lowered the price of tea, but the tea was still taxed through the Townshend Acts. So colonists thought that this was an attempt to mollify or kind of placate, be like, hey, we're lowering the price of tea, so now it's not so bad that the tea is being taxed. But instead of actually mollifying them, it just kind of instilled further anger, instilled further revolution, and that led us to what we now know as the Boston Tea Party. All right, so we have all of these acts, all of these things. What was the impact of these? Well, it led to that idea of no taxation without representation. The colonists thought that they were being treated unfairly, which led to the Continental Congresses that eventually wrote that Declaration of Independence. All right, so please go ahead and make sure to pause this video and make sure that you have all of these notes down. And then once you are, we are ready to move on to our part 3 of our learning.